The carriage wheels crunched over frost-hardened ground as Victor Garrett's rig rolled up to his ranch house. November dusk pressed down on the valley, turning everything the color of old pewter. Wrapped packages filled the seat beside him, treasures from San Francisco, each one chosen with care, each one expensive. Two small figures watched from the porch. Sarah stood with her arms crossed against the cold. 8 years old and solemn. Thomas leaned against the rail, 6 and already learning to be still. Behind them, a woman's silhouette filled the doorway, her hand resting on Sarah's shoulder. Margaret Chen, his cook, his housekeeper, the woman who kept his house running while he built his empire. Victor climbed down, muscles stiff from the 2-day journey. "I brought you something," he called, reaching for the packages. "Thank you, Father," Sarah said. Her voice carried the same flat courtesy she'd used with a stranger. Inside, the parlor felt cold despite the fire in the hearth. Victor distributed his gifts with ceremony. China dolls with porcelain faces and real hair, hand-painted tin soldiers in perfect formations, a music box from a shop on Montgomery Street, its mechanism Swiss and precise. Sarah unwrapped her doll slowly, examining the painted features. "It's very nice," she said. Thomas lined up his soldiers on the carpet, arranging them by color rather than army. "Thank you, Father." And they said the right words. Their faces showed nothing. Within 10 minutes, both children had drifted toward the back of the house. Victor heard laughter, real laughter, bright and unguarded, coming from the kitchen. He followed the sound like a man following lamplight through fog. Margaret sat by the big iron stove, flour dusting her apron. Sarah nestled against her left side, Thomas against her right. The firelight turned them into a portrait, something warm and complete. "And the rabbit," Margaret was saying, her voice animated in a way Victor had never heard in his presence. Knew he couldn't outrun the fox. So what did he do? "He outsmarted him," Thomas shouted. "That's right. He led that old fox straight to the farmer's yard, where the dogs were sleeping. And when those dogs woke up..." She caught sight of Victor in the doorway. Her voice faltered. The spell broke. Sarah straightened immediately. "Father, we were just..." "Don't stop on my account," Victor said. His own voice sounded stiff, formal. A stranger's voice in his own home. "It's late," Margaret said, rising. "You two should get ready for bed. Thank your father again for the lovely gifts." They did, with the same hollow courtesy as before. Then they were gone. Footsteps fading up the stairs. Victor stood alone in the kitchen doorway. The stove ticked as metal cooled. Margaret busied herself wiping down the already clean table. "They're good children," she said without looking at him. "Very respectful." The word hung between them like an indictment. Later that night, Victor found the toys in the parlor. The dolls sat propped on a chair, staring at nothing with their glass eyes. The tin soldiers lay scattered near the hearth, their perfect formations already broken. The music box remained on the table, unopened, its Swiss mechanism silent. He'd spent 3 months' wages on gifts his children would never touch. Margaret appeared in the parlor doorway carrying a tea tray. She moved quietly, the way she did everything, making herself small in spaces that should have been hers as much as anyone's. "I thought you might want something warm," she said, setting the tray on the side table. "It's a cold night." Victor looked up from the scattered soldiers. They didn't even play with them. "They're tired, I expect." "Long day." "That's not it." He picked up one of the dolls, its face perfect and emotionless. "Tell me the truth, Margaret. When was the last time Sarah asked for me?" She paused, her hands going still on the tea things. "Children ask for what they know they can have." The words were gentle, but they cut like wire. "How long have you been with us?" Victor asked. 3 years. 3 years this January." He'd hired her a year after Catherine died. A widow herself. Margaret had come west after her husband was killed in a mining accident. She'd needed work. His household had needed someone to hold it together while he threw himself into land deals and surveys and the endless pursuit of more. The silence stretched. Victor realized he was waiting for her to fill it. The way she filled everything else in this house, the quiet spaces, the empty hours, the gaps left by his absence. They don't need things. Mr. Garrett. Her voice was soft but firm. They need you. She left before he could respond, taking the tea tray with her. The cup she'd poured for him sat untouched, growing cold. Victor remained in the parlor until the fire burned low. Through the window, he could see the bunkhouse where his ranch hands slept. Beyond that, acres of land he'd bought and sold, traded and developed. He'd built something here, an empire of sorts. But upstairs, his children slept in rooms he rarely entered, living lives he barely knew. He climbed the stairs quietly, pausing outside Sarah's door. A strip of lamplight showed beneath it. He heard her voice, soft and conspiratorial. "Do you think he liked the city better than us?" Thomas's reply was too quiet to make out. "Maybe next time he'll stay longer." Sarah said, "Then Margaret can finish the story about the bear." Victor's hand fell away from the doorknob. He stood in the dark hallway, listening to his daughter find comfort in someone else's voice, someone else's stories, someone else's presence. The house settled around him with small creaks and sighs. Somewhere a shutter knocked against wood. The wind was picking up, carrying the smell of snow. He looked at his hands in the darkness. These hands had signed deeds worth thousands. They'd built wealth his children would inherit. But they couldn't braid hair or tell stories or make his daughter laugh. Margaret's words echoed, "They need you." He just didn't know how to be what they needed. Victor sat at his desk that night, a single lamp burning. The daguerreotype of Catherine looked back at him from its silver frame. She'd been 26 when it was taken, a year before Thomas was born. Her expression was serious. People didn't smile for photographs, but he remembered the laugh that came 5 seconds after the shutter closed, after she died. He'd made a promise. His children would want for nothing. They'd have education, opportunity, security, everything money could buy. He'd kept that promise. God knows he'd kept it. What he hadn't given them was simple. He hadn't given them himself. The next evening, after supper, Victor gathered his courage. "I thought I might tell you a story tonight," he announced to Sarah and Thomas. Before bed, they exchanged glances, uncertain. "That would be nice, Father," Sarah said carefully. He settled into the chair beside Thomas's bed. Sarah perched on the edge. He began the rabbit story, the one he'd heard Margaret telling, but immediately, the details escaped him. What color was the rabbit? Where did it live? What was the fox's name? The rabbit was brown. Sarah interrupted. "Not gray." "Right, brown." He tried to continue. "And the fox chased him to the farmer's yard," Thomas supplied. "Where the dogs were?" Were there 3 dogs or 4? 2, Sarah said, frowning. "Father. That's not how Margaret tells it." He pushed on, fumbling through plot points he half remembered. The children kept correcting him wrong details, wrong names, wrong ending. Each correction felt like a small failure. "Finally," Sarah said, "maybe we should just ask Margaret to tell it properly." The words were innocent. She didn't mean them cruelly, but they landed like a blow anyway. "You're right," Victor said. Standing. "I'm not very good at this." "You're trying," Thomas offered, but his tone suggested trying wasn't quite enough. Victor retreated to the hallway. "Through the walls," he heard Sarah whisper. "Papa tries, but he doesn't really know us." "Does he?" "Margaret knows us," Thomas whispered back. Victor stood outside their room, one hand pressed against the wallpaper Catherine had chosen. Downstairs, he could hear Margaret moving through the kitchen, banking the stove for the night. her routines as familiar to his children as breathing. He didn't know Sarah's favorite color, didn't know what Thomas dreamed about, didn't know the words to the songs Margaret sang or the stories she told or the small rituals that shaped his children's days. Margaret knew. Margaret had been their real parent while he'd been their provider. He walked to the window at the hall's end. Outside, the first frost was forming on the glass, delicate crystals spreading like lace. The ranch hand said a hard winter was coming. The signs were all there: early frost, thick fur on the horses, birds flying south in unusually large flocks. Winter was coming, and his children were strangers. Something had to change. He had to change. But he didn't know how to become someone they needed instead of someone who simply paid the bills. The frost thickened on the window, in its patterns. He thought he saw Catherine's face, but when he looked directly, it was just ice and darkness and his own reflection staring back. The next morning, Victor found Margaret in the kitchen kneading bread dough. Flour dusted her hands and forearms. She worked with steady rhythm, pressing and folding, pressing and folding. The motion looked almost meditative. He cleared his throat. She glanced up, surprise flickering across her face. "Mr. Garrett, I didn't hear you come in. I wanted to ask you something." He'd rehearsed this moment, but now the words felt clumsy. "I need your help." Her hands stilled in the dough. "Sir, teach me," he said simply. "Teach me my own children." Margaret stared at him. "I'm not sure I understand. Last night I tried to tell them a story. They corrected me a dozen times. I don't know their favorite tales or their fears or what makes them laugh." He forced himself to continue. "You do. You know everything I don't. You want me to teach you how to be their father. I want to know what Sarah's afraid of in the dark. What makes Thomas laugh. Every story they love, every small thing that matters to them." He met her eyes. "Everything you know that I don't." Margaret considered him for a long moment. Finally, she nodded slowly. "All right, but this isn't something you can learn from a book. Mr. Garrett, you have to be present." "I'll be present." She wiped her hands on her apron. "Sarah's afraid of the barn at night. She thinks there are wolves in the shadows, though there aren't any wolves for 50 miles. Thomas collects rocks, pretty ones, unusual colors. He keeps them under his bed." Victor absorbed this information like a man dying of thirst. Details about his own children. Intimate knowledge that should have been his. "They love stories where the smallest creature wins through cleverness," Margaret continued. "Sarah likes her hair braided tight, says loose braids give her headaches. Thomas hums when he's content, usually right before falling asleep." "Show me," Victor said. "The braiding, the routines, everything." That evening, Margaret convinced Sarah to let her father watch the evening ritual. Victor stood awkwardly in the doorway as Margaret demonstrated the braiding, not too tight to hurt, not too loose to come undone. Her fingers moved with practiced ease. "Your turn," Margaret said, stepping aside. Sarah looked uncertain, but she sat still while Victor tried to copy the pattern. His fingers felt thick and clumsy. The braid came out crooked. "That's all right," Margaret said. "You'll get it." Sarah didn't pull away. That alone felt like victory. Later, they sat together at the kitchen table for supper, not the formal dining room, but the warm kitchen where Margaret usually ate alone. It was a small thing, but it shifted something fundamental. Thomas talked about a blue rock he'd found by the creek. Sarah mentioned a horse in the south pasture that let her pet its nose. Victor listened, really listened, to his children's voices. Margaret watched from the stove, a slight smile touching her lips. That night, she found Victor in the kitchen after the children had gone to bed. He was studying a small blue stone, the one Thomas had shown at dinner. "He gave it to me," Victor said, holding it up to the lamplight. "Said I could keep it." "That's quite an honor. He doesn't give those away lightly." "How do you know all this?" Margaret. How do you know them so completely? I pay attention, she said simply. I'm here. The words weren't a rebuke, just truth. Victor set the stone carefully on the windowsill, where the morning light would catch it. Thank you, he said, for agreeing to teach me. They're good children. Mr. Garrett, they want to love you. You just have to let them. After she left, Victor remained at the kitchen table. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of snow. But inside, in this room that smelled of bread and coffee and something indefinably like home, he felt the first stirring of hope. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe he could still learn to be what his children needed. December brought snow that transformed the ranch into something from a storybook. Drifts piled against the barn. Icicles hung from the eaves like crystal teeth. The children pressed their faces to windows, watching the world turn white. Victor had been practicing. Every evening, he sat with Sarah and Thomas, attempting the stories Margaret had taught him. He still stumbled over details, still forgot names. But he was getting better. Tonight, he decided to try alone. Margaret stood in the hallway outside Thomas's room, listening but not intervening. Victor could feel her presence like a safety net. Once there was a rabbit, he began, settling into the chair between the beds. A brown rabbit with clever eyes. What was his name? Sarah asked. Victor remembered this one. Cottontail. Sarah nodded. Satisfied, Thomas pulled his blanket up under his chin. The story unfolded. Victor made his voice deep and gruff for the fox, high and quick for the rabbit, when he described the rabbit leading the fox to the farmer's yard. He heard Thomas giggle, and when those dogs woke up, Victor continued, pitching his voice into a growl. They chased that fox all the way back to the forest. The fox never bothered Cottontail again. Do the bear voice, Thomas said, like Margaret does. Victor attempted at a rumbling bass that made Thomas laugh outright. The sound hit Victor's chest like warmth spreading. Sarah corrected him only twice. Thomas laughed 3 times. When Victor finished, both children were smiling. That was better, Papa, Sarah said, using the word without seeming to notice. Papa, not father. Victor left them to sleep, closing the door quietly. In the hallway, Margaret waited. Better, she said, and her smile was genuine. I still sound like I'm negotiating a land deal. You sound like a father trying, that's what matters. They walked downstairs together. Margaret poured coffee while Victor built up the fire in the kitchen stove. Somehow, this had become their routine quiet moments after the children slept, sharing the day's small victories and defeats. Tell me about your husband, Victor said, surprising himself. Margaret's hands stilled on the coffee pot. James, he was a good man, reckless, but good. She poured 2 cups, handed him one. He died trying to prove himself in a mine everyone said was played out. Left me with nothing but grief and too much pride to go home. Home being Boston. My family wanted me to come back, take charity from relatives who'd never approved of James. She sipped her coffee. I came west instead. Figured if I was going to be alone, I'd do it on my own terms. Victor understood that. After Catherine died, people told me to remarry quickly, for the children's sake. But I couldn't. He stopped, the words catching. So you built an empire instead, Margaret said gently. I thought if I made enough money, proved I could provide, it would be enough. He laughed without humor. I was wrong. They sat in comfortable silence. Snow tapped against the windows. The stove ticked and settled. Can I ask you something? Margaret said. Why now? Why decide to change now? Because I finally saw what I was losing. Victor stared into his coffee. I stood in that doorway and watched my daughter's face light up for someone else. Realized I was becoming a stranger in my own home. That terrified me more than anything. Margaret's expression softened. You're not a stranger anymore. You're learning. Because you're teaching me. Because you're willing to be taught. That's the hard part. Their hands brushed as they both reached for the sugar bowl. Both noticed. Neither acknowledged it. But something shifted in the air between them. Recognition of two lonely people finding unexpected. Companionship in the quiet hours. Outside. The snow continued to fall. Inside, by the kitchen fire, Victor felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. He felt like he might be coming home. 3 weeks before Christmas, Victor took the children to town for shopping. The main street was decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons. Shop windows displayed toys and books and penny candy. Sarah held his hand as they walked. Thomas ran ahead, fascinated by everything. In the general store, Victor was examining fabric for a dress for Sarah when he heard the voices. 2 women stood one aisle over, speaking loudly enough to be heard. I'm just saying, it's unseemly. Mrs. Henderson was saying to Mrs. Cole, a widower spending that much time alone with his cook. Those poor children need proper guidance, not that sort of influence. I heard she's teaching him how to braid hair, Mrs. Cole replied, voice dripping with implications. Sounds rather intimate, if you ask me. The man has responsibilities, a position in this community. What kind of example is he setting? Victor's jaw tightened. He started toward the aisle, ready to confront them. But a small hand gripped his sleeve. Sarah stared up at him, her face pale. She'd heard every word. Papa, she whispered. Let's just go. Outside, the December cold bit through their coats. Thomas caught up to them, chattering about something he'd seen in the window. He hadn't heard the gossip. Sarah's silence spoke volumes. They were nearly to the wagon when she asked, Are people going to be mean to Margaret because of us? The question hit Victor like a fist. What number, sweetheart? That lady said bad things about Margaret and you. Sarah's eyes were too old for 8 years. I don't want Margaret to get hurt because we need her. Victor knelt in the snow, bringing himself to Sarah's level. Listen to me. Those women don't understand. They don't know Margaret, or you, or what our family needs. But they'll talk, Sarah said. And talking hurts people. She was right. In a town this small, reputation mattered. Gossip could poison everything. That evening, after the children went to bed, Victor found Margaret in the kitchen. She was preparing tomorrow's bread, her movements efficient and calm. Margaret, we need to talk. She looked up, reading something in his expression. All right. People are talking. About us. About the time we spend together. The words felt heavy as stones. I think we should maintain more professional distance. For your reputation. Margaret's face went carefully blank. I see. It's not that I don't value... He struggled for words. I just don't want you to be hurt by association with me. How considerate. Her voice was flat. Margaret, of course, Mr. Garrett, as you wish. She wiped her hands on her apron. I'll serve meals formally from now on. Keep to my quarters in the evenings. Maintain appropriate distance. That's not what I... Will that be all? Sir. The sir was like a wall going up between them. Victor opened his mouth. Closed it. He'd meant to protect her. Instead. He'd wounded her. Yes, he said finally. That's all. Margaret served dinner the next evening in the formal dining room. She didn't linger. Didn't meet Victor's eyes. The children noticed immediately. Why isn't Margaret eating with us? Thomas asked. She's busy, Victor said. She's never too busy, Sarah countered. Did we do something wrong? No, everything's fine. But everything wasn't fine. The house felt cold despite fires in every hearth. Margaret performed her duties with perfect professionalism and zero warmth. The easy companionship of late-night coffee and quiet conversation was gone. Victor lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. He'd chosen propriety over authenticity, fear over courage. He'd made the safe choice. And in doing so, he'd hurt the one person who'd shown his children unconditional love. The one person who'd patiently taught him how to be their father. Outside his window, Sarah's voice drifted up from below. She must have gone to Margaret's room. "Why won't you tell us stories anymore?" Sarah was asking. Margaret's reply was too soft to hear, but her tone carried sadness. Victor had made a terrible mistake. He'd let other people's small minds dictate what happened in his own home, with his own family, and Margaret was family. She'd been family for 3 years, whether he'd acknowledged it or not. The question was whether he'd destroyed that before he'd even recognized it. The blizzard hit on a Sunday night. Wind screamed around the house, driving snow horizontal. Victor watched from the parlor window as drifts climbed the fence posts. They'd be snowed in for days, trapped in forced proximity with a woman who wouldn't meet his eyes. The first day passed in strained silence. Margaret performed her duties with mechanical efficiency. The children asked repeatedly what was wrong. Victor had no answers that wouldn't make things worse. The second night, Thomas spiked a fever. Victor heard the commotion from his study, Sarah's frightened voice calling for Margaret. Quick footsteps in the hallway. He found them in Thomas's room. The boy lay flushed and restless, his skin burning. Margaret had her hand on his forehead, her face composed but tense. "It's high," she said, not looking at Victor. "I'll get cool water and willow bark tea." Sarah clutched Victor's hand. "Papa, is Thomas going to die like Mama did?" The question drove the air from his lungs. He'd never talked to his children about Catherine's death. Not really. Just said she'd gone to heaven and wouldn't be coming back. Clean and simple and completely inadequate. He sat on the edge of Thomas's bed, pulling Sarah onto his lap. "No, sweetheart, your brother has a fever. People get fevers and get better all the time. But Mama got sick and didn't get better. Your Mama had something different, something the doctors couldn't fix." His throat tightened. "Thomas is going to be fine." "How do you know?" "Because Margaret knows how to help him. And because I'm not going to let anything happen to either of you." Margaret returned with cloths and tea. She worked in silence, bathing Thomas's face and neck, coaxing medicine past his lips. Her movements were practiced, gentle, efficient. Sarah watched from Victor's lap, still frightened. Victor found himself talking, words spilling out, real words about Catherine for the first time. "Your mama was brave," he said. "When she knew she was dying, she made me promise to take care of you, to make sure you were happy." His voice cracked. "I don't think I've done a very good job of that." "You try," Sarah said softly. "Trying isn't enough. Your mama didn't just try. She was there. Every moment, she sang to you, told you stories, knew what scared you and what made you laugh." He looked at Margaret, who'd gone still, listening. She was present, the way Margaret's been present. Margaret's hands trembled slightly on the cloth. "She used to sing this terrible song," Victor continued, off key, all the wrong words. "Made me laugh every time. You have her smile, Sarah, and Thomas has her stubborn chin." He talked through the night, telling his children real stories about their mother. Not the sanitized saint he'd made her into, but the real woman, funny and fierce and flawed and deeply loved. By morning, Thomas's fever had broken. He slept peacefully, color returning to his face. Margaret stood by the window, silhouetted against snow-bright light. Victor saw her shoulders shake, realized she was crying. Margaret. "I'm glad he's all right," she said, voice thick. "You love them." It wasn't a question. She turned, tears on her face. "Of course I love them. How could I not?" The blizzard had blown itself out. Brilliant sunlight reflected off endless white. The world outside looked new-made, clean, full of possibility. "Walk with me," Victor said. They bundled in coats and boots, left Sarah watching over her sleeping brother. Outside, the cold bit sharp and clean. Their breath plumed in the air. I made a mistake, Victor said. I let fear decide. Let other people's small minds dictate what happens in my home. With my family? Margaret said nothing, waiting. And you are family. Margaret, to all of us. Have been for 3 years. Whether I was smart enough to see it or not. The town can think what it likes. My children need you. I need... He struggled with the words. I need to learn how to do this. Not just parenting, being whole again, being more than land deeds and bank accounts. What are you saying? I'm saying I was wrong. I'm saying the most valuable thing in my life is what happens in that kitchen every evening. Stories and laughter and people who care about each other. He met her eyes. I'm saying please don't pull away. Please keep teaching me. Please stay. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Snow crunched under their boots. A crow called from the barn roof. All right, she said finally. I'll stay. Relief flooded through him. Thank you. But Victor. She used his first name for the first time. You can't let fear decide anymore. Not about this. Not about us. Us. The word hung in the air between them. Full of implications neither was quite ready to name. No more fear, he agreed. They stood in the snow-bright garden. Two people who'd found each other through shared grief and patient teaching. The land stretched white and new around them, waiting for spring. March brought the thaw. Ice melted from the eaves. Mud appeared in the yard. The children started talking about spring calves and garden planting. Victor had spent the winter learning. He could braid Sarah's hair now, though not as neatly as Margaret. He knew all of Thomas's stories, all their fears and dreams and small preferences. He'd become present in his children's lives, not through grand gestures, but through accumulated moments. One evening, Margaret made a suggestion. I think you should tell them a story. Your own story, not one I taught you. I don't know any others. Then make one up. She smiled. You're ready. That night. Victor gathered his children by the kitchen fire. Margaret settled in the corner, mending in her lap, listening but not interfering. Once there was a man, Victor began, who lost his way. Sarah and Thomas leaned forward. He had everything he thought mattered: money and land and a big house. But he was alone because he'd forgotten the most important thing: you can't buy love. You can't purchase belonging. The best things in life are free. The story unfolded. A man who'd lost his wife and nearly lost his children. A wise woman who taught him that presence mattered more than presents. That showing up was more valuable than any gift. Victor didn't use silly voices. He didn't try to copy Margaret's style. He told it in his own words, from his own heart. When he finished, the room was quiet. Then Sarah climbed into his lap, something she hadn't done in years. That was a good story. Papa, not father. The word settled into his chest like warmth. Thomas yawned. Content. Tell it again tomorrow. Tomorrow, I'll tell you a different one. Margaret stood in the doorway, tears on her face. Their eyes met across the room. Everything crystallized in that moment. This was his family. These three people. This warmth. This belonging. Later, after the children slept, Victor found Margaret in the kitchen. She was banking the fire for the night, her movements automatic. Margaret, I have a question to ask you. She turned, uncertain. But I want to do it properly. I want you to know this isn't about convenience, or the children's needs, or any practical consideration. He took her hand, felt it tremble in his. You taught me to be present, to value what's real. And Margaret, you are the realest thing in my life. Her breath caught. I love you, he said simply. Not because you're good with my children, though you are. Not because you hold this house together. though you do. I love you because you're kind and patient and strong. Because you see people clearly and love them anyway. Because when I'm with you, I'm the man I always wanted to be." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Will you marry me?" he asked. "Not as my employee or my children's caretaker, but as my equal partner, my love, my family." Margaret's hand tightened on his. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." He kissed her there in the kitchen. With the banked fire glowing and the night pressing close outside, it felt like coming home after years of wandering. Like finding what he'd been searching for in all the wrong places. Like finally understanding that the best things couldn't be bought or sold, only built. Day by day. Through patience and presence and love. Outside. The first robin of spring called. Inside. A new family took shape. They married in April when early wildflowers dotted the meadow. The ceremony was simple, the circuit preacher. The ranch hands as witnesses. Sarah and Thomas standing beside them in new spring clothes. Sarah wore a crown of wildflowers Margaret had helped her weave. Thomas clutched the wedding rings. Solemn with responsibility. "Do you take this woman?" The preacher asked Victor. "I do." No hesitation. "Do you take this man?" "I do," Margaret said, her voice steady and sure. The ranch hands cheered. Sarah threw her wildflower crown in the air. Thomas immediately began searching for interesting rocks among the wedding guests. In town the following week, Mrs. Henderson made a disapproving comment loud enough to be heard. Sarah, standing beside Margaret in the general store, turned with perfect dignity. "Mrs. Henderson," she said, her voice clear and calm, "Margaret is my mama now. You should be respectful." Mrs. Henderson's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Margaret squeezed Sarah's hand, pride shining in her eyes. Victor, watching from across the store, had never been prouder of his daughter. Life settled into new rhythms. The parlor remained unused, those expensive dolls and tin soldiers long since donated to the church. The family gathered each evening in the kitchen, the heart of their home. Victor still speculated in land, still built his empire, but now he came home at reasonable hours. Now he knew the important things: Sarah's dreams of becoming a veterinarian, Thomas's fear of thunderstorms, Margaret's preference for coffee over tea. He could braid hair and tell stories and turn ordinary moments into something sacred. One evening in late April, the four of them sat by the kitchen stove. Victor told a story about a clever fox. Margaret mended Sarah's torn dress. Sarah drew pictures of horses in her sketchbook. Thomas arranged his rock collection on the table, organizing them by color and size. Laughter rose between them like wood smoke, warm and genuine and belonging. Margaret caught Victor's eye across the space. She smiled, and he smiled back. No words needed. They'd built this together, this family, this home, this life, outside. The last snow melted from the high peaks. The land awakened to spring grass greening, flowers blooming, birds returning from their southern migrations. Inside, a family made not of blood alone, but of choice and patience and stories more valuable than all his. Speculation settled into the beautiful, ordinary rhythm of home. Sarah leaned against Margaret's shoulder. Thomas hummed softly, the sound he made when content. Victor's hand found Margaret's, their fingers intertwining naturally. He looked around the warm kitchen at the blue stone on the windowsill. The pictures Sarah had drawn stuck to the wall. The jar of Thomas's rocks. The coffee pot always ready on the stove. He'd owned half the territory at one point. Bought and sold acres of land, made fortunes on paper. But this kitchen, these people, these simple moments, this was the only wealth that mattered. "Tell the one about the rabbit again," Thomas said sleepily. Victor began the story. His story now, told in his own voice, in his own way. Outside, spring rain started to fall, gentle and renewing. Inside, they were home.